I'm here with my friends Caitlin and Sydney to talk about something that people have probably struggled with the most in all of the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Polygamy. So polygamy is a part of church history that a lot of people don't really want to think about, even though it's been over 120 years since the church officially ended the practice of plural marriage. And I grew up learning about it, and obviously I trust that one day we'll know all the reasons for it, but honestly, I don't know if I could have done it. I think it would take a lot of faith.
Yeah, I don't know if I could have done it either. I kind of wish that we talked about it a little more at church because many people don't seem to say more than just have faith that it was for a reason, but nobody seems to really have any answers about it.
Well, let's talk about it because you're right. A lot of people assume that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young just wanted to sleep with a lot of women and polygamy was their solution, which actually is not true.
All right, let's go for it. Let's talk about polygamy.
Okay.
Wow, there are a lot of questions out there.
Okay, well, this looks like a good one to start with. So it says, how do we know that Joseph Smith and the whole doctrine of plural marriage wasn't motivated by sex, or at least highly encouraged by it?
Yep, the first accusation on every internet page that talks about polygamy.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all wondered it though at some point, right? When you start to study out the details of polygamy, there's always that little nagging voice in the back of your head that wonders if it really did come from God.
Especially when a ton of people, they just assume that Joseph Smith was this cult leader who just took advantage of women.
The thing is that Joseph avoided polygamy for as long as he could, for years, and was very reluctant to live it. And so if he had just been in it for the convenient sex, he would have just went for it, right? But he didn't. And actually, one of his wives, Helen Mar Kimball, she wrote to a friend and said, if Joseph had had any impure desires, he could have gratified them in the style of the world, with less danger of his life or his character than to do as he did. But the Lord commanded him to teach and to practice that principle. And so if you look at the accounts of how polygamy was introduced, he approached these women very carefully and sometimes over time, and first explained to them the spiritual doctrine of polygamy. And there's no evidence that he actively courted these women or flirted with them or got sealed to them after episodes of mounting passion. Polygamy was first and foremost a spiritual doctrine.
Yeah. Well, let's look at this other question. Did Joseph Smith love his wives or even cultivate real relationships with them? He did. Joseph considered himself to be a real husband in every way to all of his earthly wives, and even the wives that he couldn't openly care for, he made arrangements for them to make sure that they were taken care of. And in fact, I have a quote from one of his wives, Lucy Walker. She wrote that Joseph often referred to the feelings that should exist between husband and wives, that they, his wives, should be his bosom companions, the nearest and dearest objects on earth in every sense of the word. So it's wrong to think that he didn't care for them or have love for them within the marriage. And it shows that he didn't approach them as a manipulator or a lover would. He approached them first to teach them the spiritual principle of plural marriage before anything else.
One thing that's always seemed significant to me is for someone who is supposedly driven by sex, DNA studies and historical evidence have said that Joseph had no known children with any of his wives, but he fathered 9 children with Emma, and that was despite long absences and jail time, persecutions, and busy schedules.
Right, and it's not like they were infertile either, because after the prophet's death, several of his wives got pregnant within weeks of getting married to other men, and many of them had large families. So it sounds like even within Joseph's plural marriages, physical relations didn't happen that often, and it doesn't sound like sex was Joseph's major driving force.
Right, I think that just the main issue for some people is the fact that he did still sleep with other women.
They weren't just other women, they were his wives in what both he and they viewed as real binding marriage consecrated by God.
Okay, next question. It's a fine line between plural wives and mistresses. What's the difference, for example, between what Joseph was doing and what John Bennett was doing with his version of spiritual wifery? All right, let's talk about this for a bit because I think for some it can be kind of confusing. John Bennett, he was an ex-soldier who helped Joseph Smith a lot when they were getting the Nauvoo City Charter. and he eventually became the mayor of Nauvoo. But as Joseph began to slowly introduce the doctrine of plural marriage, John began going around seducing women into sleeping with him in something that he called spiritual wifery. And he told them that it wasn't a sin to be intimately involved as long as they didn't tell anybody about it. And he convinced them by telling them that other leaders of the church were doing it too, and that the Lord had approved it.
So basically, he tricked them and took advantage of their faith.
Yeah, his spiritual wifery was actually really different than plural marriage. There was no ceremony or spiritual aspect of any kind in what he was doing. He deserted the women. He didn't take care of them or exchange vows with them at all. He treated them basically like conquests or prostitutes. And one of his friends, who also practiced spiritual wifery, they came into a store once and paid a woman $2, basically in compensation for sleeping with him. Also, his spiritual wifery didn't help to create or strengthen family or eternal bonds. In fact, he promised some of the women that he would use his military medical training to perform abortions if any of them happened to get pregnant, so that no one would ever know, although there's no record of that actually happening.
Yeah, and after John got found out, Joseph tried to take care of things quietly to avoid scandal and problems with church critics. And John promised that he would reform, but he eventually was exposed and excommunicated.
Right, and if Joseph had just instituted plural marriage for the easy sex, then John Bennett totally would have supported him. But instead, Joseph exposed and disavowed Bennett's acts publicly.
Exactly, and Joseph was devastated and angry that he used his name to commit adultery. But in the weeks before the weeks that he left Nauvoo, he actually admitted and gave a signed statement that he had never knew Joseph to be guilty of any improper conduct, and that Joseph had never taught him that illegal sexual relations was justifiable in any way.
So there were some clear differences between this so-called spiritual wifery and plural marriage. Another telling difference is that the women who were seduced by John Bennett felt that it was wrong, and many of them came forward as witnesses or signed statements testifying against him. And none of Joseph's wives ever did any of that. Even after his death, even those who had eventually left the church and had the chance to denounce the prophet, they lived the principle in faith, and they truly believed that it came from the Lord. Also, Joseph asked for their hand in marriage and received permission from their families. So he taught them the doctrine as he received it, he gave them the choice for their personal lives, and he accepted their decision, whatever it was. John Bennett used shame to manipulate the women he seduced.
Did Joseph Smith publicly deny being a polygamist? If it was so right before God, then why would he have to lie about it? Again, he was put into an incredibly difficult position between the norms of his society and what the Lord had asked of him. Then William Law, who left the church at the time, accused Joseph of committing adultery. But if you look and you actually go back to see what Joseph Smith said, they were very carefully worded denials, since polygamy was still illegal in Illinois, even though it was not illegal in Nauvoo according to the permissions that were given from the city charter. But what he denied most emphatically was of being an adulterer, especially after the John Bennett scandal, because he wasn't an adulterer. He married his wives, he cared for their welfare, but he handled the situation very carefully, and he knew that the things that he said would go out not only to the saints at large, but also to the critics of the church.
Okay, this one asks, if Joseph didn't have any children with anyone other than Emma, then what was the point of him being a polygamist? I mean, Brigham Young and most other polygamists had these large families, but Joseph just had lots of wives and no children. Why didn't the Lord just wait until they got to Utah before introducing the doctrine? Well, first of all, no one really knows the Lord's reasons for this other than the ones we've been given. But one reason I think personally is that polygamy was really difficult for the saints to accept, and it took some time to establish. And Joseph himself resisted living it fully for years. And maybe the saints would have accepted it better coming from Joseph than they would have from Brigham Young, but again, nobody knows. And Eliza R. Snow, the Second Relief Society president, she was one of Joseph's wives and the sister of the future prophet Lorenzo Snow. She wrote about Joseph's struggle that he had with polygamy at first, and she said this: He knew the voice of God. He knew the commandment of the Almighty to him was to go forward, to set the example and establish celestial plural marriage. God, who is above all, had given the commandment. So, although Joseph didn't truly understand why the Lord had asked him to do this, he lived it with faith, and he set the example for the future saints that would go out west and establish polygamy for as long as it was needed.
Next question. One of the things that is hard to explain away is just how changeable it all is. In the Old Testament, you have polygamous prophets like Abraham and Jacob, but then other monogamous ones like Noah. In the Book of Mormon, Jacob teaches the evils of having more than one wife. Yet we believe that Joseph Smith was commanded by God to live polygamy, while at the same time believing that it's now immoral and wrong, and people are excommunicated for it. So which is it? If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then why would his commandments flip-flop so radically? It seems like a real contradiction. So it does kind of seem that way, right? But the thing is that God doesn't change, but sometimes his commandments do, and for reasons that we don't fully understand in that moment. So, for example, with the Jews in the Old Testament, the Lord had told them what kinds of meat they should and shouldn't eat, which we believe was later changed. And then also, there's an example in the Book of Mormon when the Lord commands Nephi to kill Laban, even though that was against the Ten Commandments for a specific reason. And so, even though it was against the commandments, we know that it saved Lehi's family, both physically and spiritually, and they later became the fathers and mothers of an entire faithful nation. So Ishmael, Abraham's first son through his plural wife Hagar, fathered 12 tribes of his own, that many believe are the ancestors of much of the Middle East, while Jacob, through his 4 wives, fathered the 12 tribes of Israel, which became the Lord's covenant people and were the keeper of God's laws and scriptures. So it wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't that the Lord was giving greater sexual freedom to his prophets. It was for a purpose. Even the prophet Jacob, while preaching against polygamy in general, acknowledged that there could be times where it would be acceptable before the Lord. In Jacob 2:30 it says, "For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people to practice polygamy. Otherwise they shall hearken unto these things." So the thing is that polygamy is always meant to be the exception, not the rule. It's meant to be temporary to fulfill God's purposes. And it has to be. It can't sustain itself with roughly equal numbers of men and women in the world.
But while we can look at scriptural examples in its historical context and see the hand of the Lord and some reasons why some commands were probably given, the Lord hasn't given very many concrete answers for why modern polygamy was commanded.
Okay, the church website actually has new topics set up online so that you can research and get answers for yourself. And I found it very interesting to see the results and blessings that came from living polygamy at that time. And it actually kind of makes sense to me. Listen to this. Plural marriage did result in the birth of large numbers of children within faithful Latter-day Saint homes. Also, marriage became available to virtually all who desired it. Per capita inequality of wealth was diminished as economically disadvantaged women married into more financially stable households. And ethnic intermarriages were increased, which helped to unite a diverse immigrant population.
So basically, even though we don't have all of the answers on this, it's important to remember that the Lord does love us and that he does things for our benefit. It's his work and his glory to bring to pass our immortality and our eternal life. And it's cool to know that the Lord knows us and is able to adapt both our trials and our blessings to help accomplish his eternal purposes and bless us with everything that we need, both in this life and in the next. Those were some really good questions. That is it for this video, but be on the lookout for video number 2 because we're going to be answering some more questions about polygamy and about Joseph and Emma specifically.